Right and proper for Waverley councillors to offer a listening space and to collect the views of those we represent and to channel those views to those in positions of responsibility. So can I ask that participants here please note that this meeting will be broadcast live on the council's YouTube channel, where a recording will be available for subsequent viewing. By participating in this meeting, participants will be deemed to have consented to being filmed and recorded. If you do not wish to be filmed or recorded, please leave the chamber or the Zoom meeting and watch instead in Committee Room 1 or on the YouTube channel. So welcome to this State of the Borough debate on the topic of water issues in Waverley Borough. We have with us the Leader of the Council, Councillor Paul Follows, the Joint Chief Executive, Tom Horwood, Councillor Liz Townsend, Councillor Victoria Keel, Councillor Janet Crowe, Councillor Steve Williams, and the Deputy Leader of Guildford Borough Council, Councillor Tom Hunt. We have an order sheet tonight, and you should see the order of business in front of you. After introductions, we will hear from each registered speaker in the order listed. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to speak, and we will ask that each speaker stick to one question or one statement each. We will then hear from any borough councillors who may wish to speak in the order indicated by me. Borough councillors will also receive 3 minutes in which to address the panel. All questions asked will then be responded to by the panel before we give a summary of the meeting and any next steps. We have 14 members of the public who have registered to speak. Can I ask that any questioners who are with us on Zoom remain patient while officers find you before you ask your question? Anyone who has not registered is free to raise their hand if they feel they would like to ask a question after those who have registered. So our first person who has registered to speak is Chris Cox, and he is on Zoom. Oh, I beg your pardon, introductions. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good evening, everyone, members and guests. My name is Councillor Paul Follows, and I'm the Leader of Waverley Borough Council and also of Godalming Town Council. Like several others here, I'm also a Surrey County Councillor too. Now, as a ward councillor, I represent the town centre of Godalming, South Hill, Erins Hill and Oxford Ridge, and I myself am also a local resident. Before I begin, can I first take this opportunity to thank you all for coming along to this evening. It's a cold Friday in December, and so it's great to see a full chamber here in person and also a full Zoom online. I know many more of you have also submitted testimony to aid our debate tonight and the subsequent actions that we hope to take. I would also like to thank all of our staff who are helping us here this evening. Thank you so much for doing everything you're doing to support this meeting and our residents. Now, you may be asking why this meeting has a slightly odd title called State of the Borough. This is a type of meeting within our council rules that allows us maximum engagement with the public between councillors. And it means that we're talking about a serious matter that impacts our area. And I firmly believe this is a matter that meets those criteria. Now, in a moment, I will ask the panel to introduce themselves as part of their opening statement before we move on to public questions. But I think it's just worth my explaining first who is not here and why, and addressing a comment that was made from the floor during the Mayor's introduction. The meeting is on a Friday night because I invited the MP for South West Surrey, the Right Honourable Jeremy Hunt MP, and the MP for Guildford, Angela Richardson MP. Friday is the usual day for meetings in the constituency for MPs, and I wanted to give them every single opportunity to be able to join us. There are no Christmas lights tonight, there are no other events. I made sure that they had as free a diary as it is possible for me to see. They have both declined. I have not been issued an invitation as the leader of this borough to attend the meeting. I've been told at least once that I may attend as a resident. There have been now emails forwarded around the borough council group, but I have not been invited in my capacity as leader of this borough. The second main group of people that are not here are Thames Water. They've declined after several requests to send anybody to this session, but have agreed to meet me to discuss the outputs of this meeting early in the new year. Now, I've asked this meeting to be with engineers and technical people who deal with the actual issues rather than a meeting with the CEO. I don't think residents want or need that kind of meeting. I think they need answers to technical questions and what's coming next. Now, like many of you here, I also had no water for the best part of 3 days. And like many of you, I observed issues with response from Thames Water and from Surrey County Council, particularly in terms of communications. Now, we have been told by Thames Water that Storm Ciarán was the cause of the outages. Now, this was one of the most mild storms to hit the local area in many years. And in fact, residents of Godalming particularly will know that when a big storm does hit the area, we know what that looks like. There's flooding, there's road closures, there's issues. So either a critical piece of water infrastructure was knocked offline by a mild storm, or other factors were in play. And I would like to know, and I know many residents would too. Such storms are common, and lessons need to be learned by Thames Water if this is almost certainly going to recur. We also all experienced issues in general with communications from Thames Water during the crisis itself, prompting me and others to put fairly lengthy updates on social media every few hours with what information that we had. We also saw huge issues with bottled water provisions and the distribution of that water, and I know my colleagues will go into this further. Many thousands of households were impacted, and we also know that it could have been many, many more. Now, my experience during this crisis was that residents, local councillors and others stepped in to fill that gap, a gap that Thames Water, Surrey Government and others are responsible for ensuring is not there at all. They failed to do this. It is my commitment to you tonight as leader of this council that any actions that are agreed in this room tonight will be used by the borough to bring Thames Water to account and ensure that residents' voices are heard. Just as we did with the listening panel that engaged on the drilling matter in Dunsfold, which resulted in Waverley Borough Council taking UCOG to court and the government to court. We will enact any of the issues that are raised here and any of the actions formally as council policy at full council next week on Tuesday. We need to ensure that even when this happens again, those responsible do this better and manage the crisis better than they did this time. At which point I will now hand over to Councillor Liz Townsend.
Thank you, Leader. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Some of you here will be very aware of the problems we've been facing in Cranley and the Eastern Villages for nearly 10 years now. Residents have voiced their considerable anger with me as they have seen the extortionate executive pay packets of Thames Water and the eye-watering bonuses and dividends paid out despite a lack of investment in our water infrastructure. And this has been alongside spiralling levels of investor debt, putting the future of Thames Water, already with the highest debt burden amongst water companies in England, at risk of collapse, and the government needing to work out a rescue plan. As customers, we are already facing potential rises of up to 40% next year to tackle the level of investment that hasn't been put into the infrastructure over 30 years of private ownership. In the meantime, my residents, customers, see 25% of drinking water lost in leaks. Cranley has experienced a really high number of leaks from our ageing asbestos cement water pipes, with some that have remained unfixed for months, some of them have remained unfixed for many years. One leak has remained unfixed for 5 years, to say nothing of the continued disruption to residents and local businesses, seeing our roads dug up time and time again, and some for the same leaks. We have had frequent interruptions in supply over the last few years. In 2022, we had 3 major interruptions in supply, one affecting 9,000 homes. As temperatures soared, you may remember the heat wave, elderly residents had to queue in 33-degree heat for their ration of two 2-litre bottles of water. There was not enough water, there was not enough Thames Water staff to hand, and one elderly gentleman actually fell carrying his water home and had to spend 4 days in hospital. Schools were forced to shut, businesses were shut, and the impact on the local economy is considerable. As with your recent outage around here, the customer service and communication from Thames Water was poor. They were slow to set up bottled water stations. Many vulnerable people on their priority list were missed, and we were very lucky that Waverley officers actually assumed the responsibility for water deliveries and carried that out. Like the recent one here, residents were without water, some of them without water for 5 days, and nearly all had to battle for any compensation. But it's not just about water supply, it's also about sewage. In times of rainfall, surface water enters the network, and due to lack of capacity in the network, we have raw sewage backflowing onto our roads and private gardens, with residents unable to flush their toilets, and with raw sewage flowing unchecked into our rivers, and at several sewage overflow points across the village. And I'm afraid I have absolutely no confidence that these pollution incidents are all being accurately recorded. There is a lack of regulation and a lack of accountability. And in the meantime, residents and water quality and our environment continue to suffer. The infrastructure is simply not fit for purpose. Only 3 days ago, Thames Water revealed an 18% rise in pollution incidents from March to September this year, and yet it is still paying out 37.5 million in dividends to its parent company. If we had a choice, probably most of us in this room would take our custom elsewhere, but we can't. Thames Water have a monopoly and we have no choice but to stay. It is actually a national scandal that it has been allowed to get to this point. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you. My name is Victoria Keel and I'm also a ward councillor for Godalming Central and Oxford and hold a portfolio on Waverley's executive. I think we're all versed in the detail of the outage which affected Godalming, the surrounding areas and also Guildford from Saturday the 4th of November. Around 13,000 residents were affected on that first day alone, with many finding no running water in the middle of the afternoon on Saturday. No information was available other than we expect it to be resolved soon on their website. A water station was then set up at Crown Court car park. Some residents who were vulnerable had received water supplies on Saturday morning, but were not informed as to why. I'd like to focus my comments on the theme I noticed most strongly as a local councillor during this water disruption: alternative supplies for those who are vulnerable and also for those made vulnerable. Many people contacted their local councillors via social media and email when they realised that despite being on the priority services register, they had not received any water. Their attempts to contact Thames Water did not always then lead to anything arriving, and so many contacted us. Our officers at Waverley Borough Council liaised with Thames Water on behalf of these individuals when we were able to raise their information. And for some, this did lead to water being delivered, but for others, there was still nothing. We also found that many care homes and sheltered accommodation were without enough water. We heard of some such units being given perhaps one bottle of water for all the residents who lived there. As well as these issues experienced by those on the priority service register, there were people who couldn't access the water stations who would not normally be considered vulnerable. Our geography being what it is, we found that some non-drivers could not have managed to walk up the steep hills carrying enough water for their household. This, of course, are just the ones that we were made aware of. This is where the absolutely tremendous efforts of the local community came into play, with local councillors of all parties queuing for water and delivering to those who needed help. Other local organisations stepped up too, offering their vehicles and volunteers to do the same, and neighbours looked out for one another. This was a true community response. For me, Thames Water needs to find ways to reassure those on the priority services register that they will receive water in such disruptions, and also perhaps to provide separate queuing systems for those who are collecting on behalf of communities in order to speed up their access to water. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing the testimonies of everybody here and on the Zoom. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Janet Crowe and I'm the Borough and Town Councillor for Farncombe and Cattershall. As you've been hearing, Thames Water let us all down badly, especially the vulnerable, over those few days in November. Not only were their communications on the crisis totally inadequate, but far too many people on Thames Water's own risk register were completely forgotten about, leading to great anxiety and distress. What we need to hear now is a full and honest explanation of what happened and what steps Thames Water has taken to minimise the risk of recurrence. More importantly, possibly, in the event that the system fails again, and there are no guarantees it won't, what will the company do to improve its emergency response plan to include a far more urgent delivery of water to critical services and vulnerable individuals, alongside effective communication? Far too many people simply had no or little information from Thames Water about what was happening, And by the way, I'm seeing far too many posts on social media about the difficulties in receiving compensation. We might hear a little more on that later. And finally, when is the government going to stop colluding in the drastic performance of this company and hold it to account, instead of allowing it to charge us more and more for less and less? I'm deeply disappointed that neither our MP Jeremy Hunt nor a representative of Thames Water were able to give us an hour of their time tonight to help us work through these issues. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Steve Williams. I'm Waverley portfolio holder for environment. Thank you, for environment and sustainability, and also ward councillor for Binscombe and Charterhouse. And unlike Liz and not living in Cranley, this was my first experience of a prolonged water outage personally. And I could talk now about the impact on myself and my family and on my neighbours and those in the community to whom I delivered water simply because I happened to have a car that I could use to collect water from what was, in the first instance, one water station in Godalming. One water station covering a town with a population, excluding the periphery, but one town with a population of 22,000 people. A town that became utterly gridlocked on day 2 of the outage, with a situation whereby water could not be delivered to Crown Court when it ran out because of the people that were queuing for water. So we need to focus tonight, in my view, on the legacy so that we can learn the lessons. The legacy is one of thousands of customers feeling badly let down, others having experienced very serious difficulties, including care homes left without water, and general bafflement, as Paul has pointed out, at how Storm Ciarán, which barely affected our area, brought a halt to water supplies for several days. There is also a legacy of 600,000 plastic bottles across Waverley and Guildford, jettisoned into our waste stream at a time when, as waste authorities, we are doing our utmost to try to eliminate and certainly reduce single-use plastic. And there was no evidence that I saw of Thames Water taking responsibility for its own plastic waste by making arrangements to clear it up. But then again, where is the evidence of Thames Water taking responsibility for keeping our rivers clean? Why is it that we have to rely on an army of volunteers and organisations like Water Rangers to monitor the quality of our local rivers while sewage spills out into them, as my colleague Liz has just pointed out? And when we hear reports that Thames Water just cannot put things right, why is it that water infrastructure has declined to such an extent, despite the profits made by Thames Water over past decades? A company with a debt pile of £14 billion, despite substantial dividends paid out to shareholders and significant pre-tax profits in recent years. So it is clear, I think, that lessons need to be learned. How can such outages be prevented in the future, in the short term and in the medium term? How can we do differently in future, both in terms of not only trying to prevent such things happening again, but also in terms of ensuring that there is a readiness to respond effectively and efficiently if and when it does. So I very much hope that today's meeting will be followed up in the regrettable absence of a Thames Water representative here today by a full and proper written response by Thames Water to the points that are made this evening when those points are presented to them by Paul as leader. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Tom Hunt. I'm the Deputy Leader of Guildford Borough Council, and I represent St Nicholas Ward in the middle of Guildford, which is just west of the river and south of the Farnham Road. I'd like to thank the Mayor and Councillor Follows for inviting me tonight. So I'm going to give some brief perspective on the Guildford residents' view of the recent outages. On Thursday, the 2nd of November, some residents of St Nicholas and Onslow wards in Guildford reported having no water. Service appeared to be restored by the following morning, but on Saturday, the 4th of November, residents were again cut off, not to be consistently restored until Friday, the 10th of November. The area affected included 2 schools and the Farnham Road Hospital, which proved extremely challenging for Thames Water to restore the service to. Some of the outages during this period were caused by failures at the Shalford water treatment works, but outages were also caused by the failure of Ladymead treatment works. As Oscar Wilde might have put it, to lose 1 treatment works might be regarded as misfortune. To lose 2 looks like chronic underinvestment. Now service has been restored to normal, residents of the affected area have broadly 3 issues with Thames Water's handling of the outage. Number 1, obviously, the failure to provide water. Thames Water has 1 job. I mean, 2 if you count taking it away. But this isn't actually the biggest complaint. Number 2, the inconsistency and inadequacy of comms. Just after 6:30 on the 4th of November, Thames Water sent customers a text message stating that water supply should soon be back to normal as they have rerouted water from another part of their network. Thames Water has since claimed that this wasn't actually physically possible in Guildford because of the island status of Guildford's water network. This illustrates the wholly inadequate nature of Thames Water comms throughout the outage. What were clearly further outages were dismissed as airlocks in the system. On the 7th of November, Thames Water told us that only 11 houses remained without supply. After I relayed this message to residents, way more than 11 residents contacted me very soon afterwards to inform me they were still without supply, clearly the number 11 being completely fictitious. On the 8th of November, low water pressure and subsequent service loss was reported across the system. Thames Water blamed this on the evening load as if this was somehow unexpected. Thames Water was slow to acknowledge the failure of the Ladymead treatment works on the 9th of November, perhaps hoping the problem would go away. We all know that hope is not a strategy, and Thames Water must learn the lessons of the need for better and more transparent communications. The third issue is compensation. Over the last week or so, residents, Thames Water's customers, have begun to receive compensation payments being credited to their bills. Thames Water's policy is to credit £30 for each period of 12 hours without water. All the residents affected were affected in broadly the same way, but credits to customers living in the same road, presumably served by the same water supply, suffering the same outages, vary from nil to £150. I can only conclude that Thames Water's invoicing department is using a random number generator to calculate credits for the outage. Thames Water have proved deficient in a number of important aspects. The wash-up following November's outages must result in changes to the way that Thames operates, and Thames Water must demonstrate transparency in learning the lessons. Now, when I was last in Thames Water's head office in Reading, there was a sign stating the company's vision, which is if you could choose a water company, you would choose Thames Water. And I wonder how many residents of Waverley or Guildford would choose Thames Water today. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, thank you. My name is Tom Horde. I'm the Chief Executive of Waverley Borough Council and for Guildford Borough Council. I'd like to just give some context about emergencies, how agencies respond to them, and in particular water emergencies. So my response is more about, in general, what ought to happen, and we can discuss really what did happen. So first of all, probably the thing to note, in particular with regard to water emergencies, is that councils were responsible for water up until 1974 and have not been since. So in no way are water companies accountable to councils, but there are levels of accountability that I will describe in a moment. So after 1974, regional water boards were created, and then in 1989, they were nationalised into the private companies that we now have. So our water supply is run by private companies, and in UK law, like all private companies, those companies are primarily accountable to their owners or shareholders, and their responsibility is to obviously to deliver the service that they're supposed to deliver and to increase the value of those companies. In terms of water supply, water companies are also accountable to government regulators. So the Drinking Water Inspectorate has an oversight for the quality of the water we drink, and Ofwat has a responsibility for prices and for performance. And water companies that fail in these things can be fined for breach of regulation or poor performance. In addition, the Water Industry Act of 1991 covers the sort of outage that we faced in Surrey in November, and where the water supply is interrupted by an emergency, such as a burst water main or failure of a treatment works, a water company is supposed to restore the supply within 12 hours of becoming aware, or for a major disruption to a strategic pipe, they must restore the supply within 48 hours. At the same time, water companies have to take reasonable steps to let customers know where they can get an alternative water supply, when it plans to restore the supply, and also provide a telephone number where customers can get more information. So those are the points of regulation that apply directly to the water companies. In an emergency, there's also something else that applies, which is the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004. So this is the piece of legislation that governs how agencies across private and public sectors respond to emergencies, and that can include natural disasters, weather, terrorism, any conceivable civil emergency, of which serious disruption to water supply would be one of those. So in that piece of legislation, there are categories of responders, but each of the agencies, whether they're public sector, such as local councils, NHS, police, fire, or whether they're utility companies, have specific responsibilities, and depending on the emergency, the appropriate agency will take a lead. So in this piece of legislation, it really does set out that in a water emergency, it is the water company that has a statutory responsibility to take a lead in that emergency. And the other agencies, like the public service agencies, have a statutory responsibility to cooperate with those agencies and to support the dealing with the emergency and recovering from it. So as an example, for example, if there are emergencies with roads, clearly Surrey County Council has a responsibility for doing that. And in other emergencies where roads are impacted, Surrey County Council will take the lead for that. For issues around social care, adult and children's social care, clearly Surrey County Council will take a lead. The Borough Council in an area like ours that has this split of local government will be responsible for housing disruption, for rest centres if those are needed, for waste disposal and collection, and also for recovery and cleanup. So what typically happens in an emergency is that the lead appropriate agency will take the lead responsibility, and then as those things develop, the lead may be handed over, particularly when you move into a recovery phase. And I'm thinking in particular in terms of major disruption to people's homes that might require evacuation, such as, could be fire, pollution, for example, where people may be evacuated. It may well be the fire service that takes the lead on the emergency, and then the local authority would take the lead on housing, rehousing, getting people back into their homes afterwards, clean up, such as that. So that's really how the legislation is set out, and typically how these things work. So each agency has a responsibility in its own area. Each must collaborate with the other. And then after an emergency, they're all responsible for participating to debrief and to learn lessons. It's a very important part after emergencies that we take the opportunity to reflect on what happened and to potentially make changes to protocols, procedures, etc. And those might be shared protocols within what's called a local resilience forum, which is chaired by Surrey County Council in terms of this incident to debrief. And it also might be internal protocols that might exist for those councils emergency services, utility companies, etc. So that's really how the process is working. And right now we are in that debrief phase. So Surrey County Council started that process off. And as Councillor Follows indicated, the results from this discussion will feed into that as well as be communicated directly to Thames Water for them to respond to us. So that's what I'd like to set out. And aside from that, thank you all very much for coming this evening. And for those of you online, thank you very much for joining us. And I'll happily hand back to Madam Mayor for your questions, and the panel will assist in whatever way we can with any answers we can give. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all. So we now come to the questions and statements from members of the public who have registered to speak, of which we have 14. So we come first to, this time, Chris Cox on Zoom. Okay, Chris Cox is absent. So we come to Councillor Claire Waitman, who's in the room.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm Claire Waitman, Deputy Leader of Godalming Town Council. As Tom Horwood outlined, town and parish councils like Godalming have no statutory role during a major incident like this. Our job as parish councillors is to advocate for our residents. So we communicated with our residents, many of whom are not online and had very little idea of what was going on for hours when the water started going off on Saturday. We all delivered water to care homes, vulnerable residents, those with small children, and those who simply don't drive and weren't able to carry heavy packs of water until late into the night on Sunday. Residents told us during this that they were frustrated, upset, and just plain livid, both at the fact that a critical resource had simply evaporated with no notice, and at the abysmal communication from Thames Water about what had caused the crisis and when exactly it was going to be fixed. One Binscombe neighbour of mine said that he felt the water company's entire approach to managing the outage was PR-led, not solution-focused. The people of Bramley, Godalming, Milford and Whitley ought never have been in the position where they were left without one of the basic necessities of life for days. And we town councillors ought never have been put in the position where, to support our residents, we had to step into the breach vacated by the company that is required by law to provide the service. The lack of a representative from Thames Water tonight to hear our experiences and concerns is illustrative of the contempt with which they hold both democratic accountability and the public they have systematically failed. And yet our residents have no confidence that such a catastrophic failure will not occur again. For while Thames Water is currently claiming to be investing billions of pounds in new infrastructure, they are in fact so heavily laden with debt that in June, the government was drawing up contingency plans in the event that the company collapsed. And the Guardian newspaper reported only 3 days ago that auditors fear the company could run out of money by April. That such a situation has been allowed to develop is an indictment not only of the whole extractive business model, where returns for investors are prioritized over the needs of people and the environment, but of the cataclysmic failure of proper regulatory oversight. For during the period up to 2017, when the Australian asset management company Macquarie burdened Thames Water with an additional £7 billion of debt, up to a total of £10 billion, 30% of it was essentially asset stripped out, paid out as dividends to overseas shareholders, bringing no benefit to the residents of the United Kingdom. Who was the chief executive of Ofwat, who signed off the business plan, allowing debt gearing to levels nearly 20% higher than the 60% recommended by Ofwat itself, as this was a matter for its own investors and their equity? Why, none other than Catherine Ross, who is now currently on this day, the joint CEO of Thames Water. Thank you to everybody for listening.
Thank you, Councillor Waitman. And now James Muller.
Oh, I need that one. There we go. Never been here before. Thank you. So my name is James Muller. I'm a resident of Godalming Central and Oxford, and I have a statement which will lead to a question. My parents were without water from Saturday the 4th of November to late afternoon Tuesday 7th November. We went down, my mother and I went down to the water station at the Crown Court to find that the staff for Thames Water were supplying in the pouring rain water to residents. Given that there are no Conservatives on the panel, and nor the invited South West Surrey MP, nor an invited representative of Thames Water, such as the interim CEO, Alistair Cochrane, both of whom are familiar with the area affected by the water chaos. The MP of which, by the way, lined up to collect water, as was seen on Twitter, but failed to actually show up to help or even make an appearance. During the water chaos, I took to X, formerly known as Twitter, to find that helpful information was being supplied by Waverley Borough councillors, very little by the MP, and even less communications from Thames Water. So I attended an Ofwat open public meeting, which was called Your Water, Your Say, and I know that one councillor, Ed Holiday, did also attend. Failed to see any response or anything, any follow-up. But I did put 2 questions to the interim CEO, Catherine Ross. The first one was to do with whether or not she can actually explain what happened. The 2 points that Catherine Ross made were that there was a variability in power supply, and that there was lots of rainfall that caused clogging of cloud mucky water. This is just completely unacceptable to come from an interim CEO in a meeting that also has the sustainability director, the retail director, who is the only person who was put to the public, and to have also a board member there who seemed to be more surprised by the response than anything else. I then followed up the question with whether or not this is going to happen again, because the repairs took 4 days, 2 days for actual engineering repairs, and then another 2 days just to see whether or not it was actually going to suffice. So my question is whether or not Thames Water itself is actually going to put out a statement apologising to residents affected in Waverley and in Guildford, and whether or not they can actually account in detail as to what actually happened. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a reminder to speakers, you have 3 minutes. The next speaker is Edmund McCudden, and he is on Zoom. Okay, we may return. So is Lord Killarney in the chamber? He's on Zoom. Okay, we think they're the same person, so we'll come back. Councillor Joan Hegan, you are in the room. You have 3 minutes.
Good evening. Thank you, Madam Mayor. I asked to speak to feedback the impressions that we gained as Godalming Town councillors, because we decided at very late notice to set up an impromptu listening point at the Farncombe Christmas market on the 2nd of December. So a month after the event, but still we felt a worthwhile moment to capture people's recollections. So it was, as I say, very ad hoc and informal. We had different channels of communication. People were invited to just register with a dot if they'd been impacted. 43 did put dots on our board, but there were many more who came and talked to us. We also put up some separate cards with potential issues that people might feel were relevant. 14 people felt that communication issues were the big one, and I won't go into any more of that because we've had quite a few speakers on that. 8 registered concerns on collection issues. People who have no car, what were they meant to do? it's ridiculous in this day and age where we're encouraging switches to sustainable travel, that the only strategy for getting people water who are not on the priority services register requires them to get into a car. And then to have a collection point that's not accessible particularly easily, and only one, as we've already had comment on, and a variable response to people who are trying to collect multiple water to assist neighbours. Then the other big one was regarding compensation, and I can top the Guildford experience because we have residents in Godalming who've received £180. Someone on Frith Hill, a few of the residents at Hampton Manor, but not all of them, but no explanation as to who's going to get what and when. So can I just ask quickly in this room, how many people think they're entitled to compensation? And how many of you have actually had what you think is your fair due? Well, that's pretty comprehensive, isn't it? If you look on the Thames Water website, actually £30 per 12 hours is quite generous when you can rapidly get up to £180 and more. It would be better though if everyone got what they are entitled to and it was fair. These are concepts unknown in Thames Water apparently. And I just want to share one particularly interesting observation from one resident who wrote, "Mum in Shalford had water delivered 48 hours before water went out. So priority register worked, but they obviously had a lot of notice this was going to happen. So why was the public response so poor?"
Thank you, Councillor Hegan. And next speaker is Councillor Ruth Thompson.
Hi, I'm going to come at a slightly different angle to everybody else. So basically, Thames Water have paid a £37 million dividend to a holding company. I've not been able to work out who exactly this holding company is. They have a very complex corporate structure. I understand this is to service the debt of the holding company in receipt of the dividend. So my question is, why was this money not used to service the not inconsiderable debt of Thames Water? Or why was the money not used to improve the infrastructure and the services of our community? This is on the back of the legality of this dividend is being investigated by Ofwat, and also on the back of their auditors now raising going concern issues. What on earth is going on, and how on earth was this approved by the CFO? Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Richard Ashworth, who's in the room.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I am a resident of Godalming on Portsmouth Road. We still have very low water pressure. We've had water pressure that's been diminishing for several years, if truth were told, and there are still times of an hour or two where some of our taps are not working. I am surprised at the absence of the Member of Parliament, and I'm even more surprised by the fact that he's going to be attending something like this in someone else's constituency, which makes this about politics rather than serving his electors. We tried to keep track of what was going on, and we were we gave up on Thames Water quite quickly because they were not helpful, really. We found that the bulletins that came from Waverley were accurate, regular, and helpful and responsive. We found the information we got from Jeremy Hunt was not very helpful, and at least on one occasion, actually very unhelpful and totally inaccurate. And my question would be for him, were he here? So perhaps this might get to his exalted ears at some point. He is selling himself in this constituency as a born-again eco-warrior with green literature. And I would like to know how it is that we have got to this state with the water authorities, and in particular, how it is that on the 3 occasions he's been presented with an opportunity to vote in Parliament against them putting nameless crud in our waterways, that he has not done so. And furthermore, why he is currently taking money from climate change deniers. And I think that's about the sum total of the question I'd like to ask him, were he present in his constituency to answer such a question? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Paul McEwen from Pepperharrow Parish Council. Are you here? I am. You are.
Pressing the green, that's better. So, well, thank you for the opportunity to exercise local democracy and for us to be able to raise our issues directly with you. Unlike the meeting which will be attended by Jeremy Hunt and Angela Richardson next week, you did not require me to submit my question in advance, so that's much appreciated. Thank you. Were Thames Water here, I would ask them, as clearly it is their mission to provide clean water to our residents. As the clerk of Pepperharrow Parish, we have a mile of the River Wey going through us between Elstead and Eashing, and we'd love to be able to test the water ourselves, not just for the expected agricultural and equestrian runoff that you would get in a rural area, but for all the things that Thames Water should be taking out of the water. So human waste, excess pharmaceuticals. That's why I'd ask them, were they here? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Godalming Town Councillor Alex Adam, who I think is on Zoom. No. Okay. And our next speaker is also Zoom, Robert Dyer. We do have Robert Dyer. So, Mr. Dyer, you have 3 minutes.
Mr. Dyer, you're still muted on the call. If you can unmute.
Might Christina Hatshaw be on Zoom? Yes, she is. So, Christina Hatshaw, you have 3 minutes.
Can I say, first of all, much Waverley Borough Council for organising this evening. I had no idea it would be so positive. I'm quite interested about compensation. We live in GU4 in Blackheath. We have yet to be recognised that we have had an outage. When the list of postcodes came up that were affected, my brother in Bristol phoned me up and said, "Oh, I see you're not affected then, Christina." And it was only at that point that I realised what was going on. So we have never been acknowledged that we were without water. And so I would be very grateful if the meeting could put that question to
next door got water delivered.
And yet our next door neighbours got water delivered because they are on the priority list, because they needed it. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much indeed. I think our next speaker, Jo Purvis, may be on Zoom. She is.
The first Zoom to work.
Hello, yes.
That's Jo.
Can you,
So, Jo,
can
yes, you have 3 minutes, Jo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Mayor, I should say. I just really would like to reinforce the points that have been made about exactly what happened, why they had to flush out the reservoirs, the nitty-gritty of what they claim happened, because in relation to such a small storm from our point of view. And building resilience in the future so that are they planning different infrastructure to cope with climate change? We can expect much worse storms, heavier rainfall, whatever it was that caused the problem that we really, really want to understand. And ideas like for the community, like sort of holding back the rainwater and things like that, structures that can help people as individuals, so that you've got, so for instance, people in flats would have access to some locally stored water for things like flushing loos, if this kind of thing is going to be unavoidable. And do they need to move the treatment centres altogether? You know, what is the problem? Is it because they're low lying, or you know, just basically it seems quite inexplicable, really, that the way things happened. And that's it, really.
Thank you, Joe. We have one other speaker on Zoom.
Yes, we have is it a Howard Brown, I believe, who's now free to speak if you want to ask your question.
Mr. Brown, you have 3 minutes.
Mr. Brown, you're still muted if you're trying to speak to the room. If you'd like to ask your question.
Okay, I think that there may be a little bit of a hiccup. We can't hear Mr. Brown. So we come now to speakers and questions, statements and questions from borough councillors. 2 have registered to speak, Councillor Gale and Councillor Ward. Councillor Gale, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Living on the south side of Gasden Lane, I didn't lose my water supply, but everyone on the north side through to Guildford did. I was actually part of Paul Follow's team delivering water to the vulnerable residents, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. And sadly, lack of investment for 34 years by water companies means we probably will experience another breakdown. The recent outage is the latest in a long line of incidents towards the villages where I come from. My concern, therefore, is that the water companies should have a plan. It has been obvious from the water outages in Dunsfold, Hambledon, Chiddingfold, Milford and Whitley over the past few months that there are no plans for setting up and manning water stations. In Dunsfold, for instance, it was a local resident who had to suggest that they could deliver water to the Wynn Hall. When Thames water failed in Hambledon, they were without water and a water station was set up in Milford. That's miles away from Hambledon, made especially worse because Thames Water dug up all the roads in Hambledon to try and find the leak. So we have a problem there. Now, during the latest outage, it took almost 3 days to get Thames Water to set up a water station in Milford to relieve the pressure on Crown Court, which was being inundated with people trying to get through. My request, therefore, to Thames Water is, please, can you put together a detailed list of approved areas for water stations? Share this information with town and parish and borough councils, so the next time we are not all spending time begging for water stations to be set up in more sensible areas to be distributed and places where residents can access them. Please try and put something together so we know what to do next time. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thames Water has on occasions released figures, some of them impressively large, about how much it intends to invest throughout its network. Most of it, of course, coming from our pockets. I am more interested in what is actually done. more particularly in our area to improve water treatment, because it seems that the water treatment plants are just not fit for purpose. The question I would like Thames Water to have answered, had they been here, is just what has Thames Water done to improve the suspect water treatment plants within Waverley over the last 3 years? Since Thames Water are not here, a written answer will be appreciated and expected. I also noticed a number of comments during this meeting about bonuses to directors and executives. In my naivety and my youth, I understood bonuses went for success rather than failure. But clearly there is another sort of thinking in the hierarchy of Thames Water, which perhaps Ofwat should look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. Are there any other borough councillors who would wish to speak? Councillor Law.
Thank you. I'm not concerned immediately about the time it took to restart delivery after the reservoirs fell empty and supply stopped. I understand from an engineering point of view, but of course, it may take time to perform checks, balances, analytical steps, following regulatory steps, etc. So provided the answers eventually come down the line, I'm comfortable with that for the time being. But I'm interested in what failed first that led to depletions of the reservoirs. Second to that, I have a comment that I am left with a supply or stock of Thames Water blister packs of water that aren't mine. I'm just holding them for the time being, and I would love to pass those off to appropriate authorities at the earliest opportunity when I know who is likely to take care of them and make use of them, rather than assume that because they've been taken off a pallet, they can't be used. Going back to the reservoirs, I've read or heard somewhere that loss of water in the reservoirs was the upstream, no pun intended, problem. So I'm interested to know, if Thames Water were available to answer, what is the mechanism that feeds those reservoirs, and what about that mechanism failed? And what about that mechanism is related to Storm Ciarán in particular? Because I don't understand the engineering or mechanical connection between a passing storm and turbo machinery apparently failing. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Law. We're just going to Councillor Rubini, who is on Zoom and ready. So then we'll come back to you. So Councillor Rubini.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for, again, for holding this tonight. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you okay, Councillor Rubini.
Thank you. What I would like to say is, for those who don't know me, I'm the council responsible for the Hazelmere area. And about 3 to 4 years ago, we had a lot of problems with supply. Like Cranley, we are supplied by old pipes that come from the Shelford area, and we rely on these pipes coming down and filling the reservoir. At that time, we had a lot of gaps in the service, and because it was gravity fed, a lot of us went off the water supply. And again, the Thames reaction was very poor. A lot of councillors delivered bottled waters themselves to the elderly residents, care homes, etc. in the area, because the actual list that Thames claimed to have kept failed completely. So obviously in the 4 years since then, they have learnt no lessons. I would also say that it was very difficult, having met the CEO and the local MP, who gave me promises of what they were going to do, to see any improvement in this infrastructure at this moment. My second part is what was mentioned originally about sewerage. I am still having a lot of problems when we get a lot of water, and these storms are increasing, with the sewerage mixing with water, coming down the roads, going into play areas and recreation grounds, and indeed flooding people's houses. As a Surrey County Councillor, I try and solve these problems, but I find it very difficult to communicate with Thames and have to go through hideways to try and get some sort of answer. So yes, I agree with all the statements that have been made tonight. In our area in Hazelmere, we have very similar problems, but fortunately not recently. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Councillors Austin and Martin, would you mind if we go back, because Mr. Edmund McCudden is now available on Zoom. So would that be all right? Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me? Hello?
We can.
Oh, hello. My name's Edmund McCudden. Apologies for my my handle that comes up on the Zoom. I'm Vice Chair of Orfold Parish Council, but I also, my son lives in Cranley, and with my 4 grandchildren, and everything that you've actually said, I've experienced, and it's very embarrassing having to fill up empty Coca-Cola bottles and water bottles in Orfold and having to deliver them to my son so that they can actually have their dinner. But my one question is what is Thames Water's 3, 5 and 10-year plan? We've discussed all of the problems in open debate, and I echo everybody else's admiration of you facilitating this meeting. But surely the main question is to Thames Water, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do in the short term, the medium and the long term? And I think that's my one question, if that's okay.
It could be 3 questions, but we get them. Thank you. So now we come back to the room and to 3 Waverley Borough councillors, starting with Councillor Austin.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I am councillor for Bramley and Wonersh Ward, which we will all know is one of the areas most affected this time round. In the last year, Bramley has dealt with, because of Thames Water, a major sewage leak, intermittent supply, and now we have had this terrible experience where members of my ward were without water for 7 or 8 days in some circumstances. Absolutely terrible. My feedback from the people who live in Bramley and Wonersh Ward is absolute distress. They felt they weren't listened to about the lack of water stations. We repeatedly asked for one in Bramley and it did not appear. Lack of help for the vulnerable. Thank you to all those local people who actually delivered buckets of water at one point to Blunden Court residents' home, old people's home. It was really tough. Poor communication from Thames Water. Just absolute sort of, check the websites for intermittent updates, some of which were just not correct. And of course, now we're dealing with compensation issues, which have been well outlined already. Therefore, I will be attending to discuss this with Thames Water directly next week at the meeting on the 15th. And I will be presenting our case and defending our case, which I have already done directly with Thames Water. At this meeting, the CEO, I just wanted to confirm really, or clarify some points which have been raised about this meeting. The CEO and his technical team will be present, so this will be a productive meeting. The reason that the 15th was agreed and requested by Thames Water is because they have not yet finished their internal reporting. That will happen at the beginning or the middle of next week. So they simply couldn't hold the meeting before that date. And the reason that the University of Surrey was agreed upon was because that is the largest forum and room in which both council areas or all of the people in the impacted areas could fit in the space. So I also just need to clarify actually that the invitation was sent on the 30th to Guildford and Waverley Borough Council by Jeremy Hunt. It was then followed up with an invitation by me to all councillors earlier this week. Paul Follows is registered to attend this meeting, so he must have received the invitation. Jeremy Hunt tonight is unable to attend because he is a long-standing commitment for a fundraiser for the Royal Surrey Cancer Centre. I just also want to confirm none of us were invited to speak on the panel tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think just to point on this meeting, I think Councillor Follows would have perhaps been better off if he'd organised the meeting by asking Thames Water and checking the date as to whether they could be here, rather than announcing the date of the meeting and expecting people to be here. So I think the meeting next week was organised with that in mind, and I think all of us are invited to, I think it's 5:30 at the Red Bidlick building at the University of Surrey. In terms of what has happened, I support almost all of the things that have been said tonight. I think what has happened has been disgraceful. I think Thames Water's communication was especially appalling, and the lack of good information and the lack of reliable information as to what was happening, when it might be fixed, and all of the things that needed to be done to get water to people were all falling short of what should have occurred. And I think I'm, of course, also interested in the compensation position, but I'll look forward next week to hearing something from Thames Water directly. The only other point that I would make is that a lot of people have made mention of Ofwat and the regulatory framework which has been around since the privatisation. I would just say that much of the work and the infrastructure which has to be done in large-scale water provision, of course, is very long-term. And I think governments of all hues have had an opportunity and have probably failed to do what they should have done. There was a Labour government for 13 years. There was a Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition for 5 years, and there's been a Conservative administration for the last 8 years. And if criticism needs to be made of long-term decisions which are deficient, then perhaps we should understand that governments of all hues have perhaps not done what they should have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Martin. Councillor Goodrich.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And as the councillor for Wallash and Bramley and Wannish, I have a particular responsibility because prior to the last election, I looked after Wannish and Blackheath. And both Blackheath and Wannish were affected by this. Not totally, because somehow or other, I live in Wannish and my water supply was all right. But my son, who lives in Farncombe, was not. So action had to be taken by me to ensure that he and his family of 5 actually had some water. The problem I have is that, as you've heard from Christina Hartshaw, this did affect Blackheath. Now, Blackheath is pretty isolated, to say the least. To have 2 water stations on offer, one in Godalming, which is, if you get decent traffic, is 12 minutes away, or Artington in Guildford, which is equally distant from Blackheath. With some people without cars, it really was a challenge. And fortunately, quite a lot of people in Blackheath rallied round to look after the more vulnerable people to ensure that water was supplied. Why they can't go to the villages that are affected and ensure that there is a stockpile put in the village hall or something of that nature, rather than expecting villages to have to travel some distance to get water, I find difficult to understand. And although he is not in my patch, after the event, I was talking to a colleague of mine or somebody I know quite well, who is in his top 80s, who actually lives in Milford, so not in my patch. And he's a registered vulnerable person. It took 4 days before Thames Water even did anything about him at all. In fact, his son used a bit of initiative. They bought water via Google, and got water delivered. Had to pay for it, but he managed that before, before they'd run out. So I think it's deplorable, and I think I agree with the speakers who've talked about the lack of communication and the total inadequacy of water stations to help the people that were affected. And let us hope Thames Water can give some answers in a week's time. I'm certainly attending the meeting to find out what their answers are. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Goodridge. We're now going back to Zoom, and Mr. Howard Brown, who I think is now able to speak.
Mr. Brown, you are still on mute at the moment. You're free to speak if you can just unmute yourself.
Are there any other councillors or residents who would like to speak? Councillor Deuce.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking in my capacity as Mayor of Godalming. I would like to thank Waverley Borough Council for stepping in, and also many Godalming town councillors and local residents in the absence of other local authorities. I would suggest that it might be appropriate that we establish our own local resilience plan in the absence of action by others, including Thames Water, led by Waverley Borough Council, which cascades where appropriate to town and parish councils that may have resources to assist. Such local resilience plans and actions, whilst not a panacea in themselves, could at least mitigate against failures elsewhere and support some of the most vulnerable care settings and citizens in our local areas. So would the leader of Waverley commit to looking at whether such local emergency resilience plans can be established?
Thank you, Councillor Deuce. So would you like to introduce yourself? And you have 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm Mark Scully. I'm Chairman of Cranley Parish Council. We've heard, obviously, that Cranley's had its fair share of issues, and Liz has highlighted many of those in her conversation earlier on. I wasn't planning to speak, but I just wanted to mention a couple of things. The water handout areas that are set up sometimes for these events. We had an issue in Cranley where water was delivered to a car park where people were due to collect it, and we then had a whole load stolen. There were some people who had decided they were going to profiteer from water at that time, and they stole a whole load of water from pallets in the car park opposite the council offices, and there was a shortage. So I think we also need to make sure that when these things are set up, if water stations are set up in pre-selected areas, that we make sure there's some kind, I wouldn't say security, but we do have challenges around policing as well, but we make sure that the water is there and not taken by people who don't need it, and it's given to people who do need it. There was a big challenge there where we had no water in 30 degrees because somebody made off with it. The other thing, which is a little bit probably diverse from this, but there must be some discussions that we can have with Thames Water or mention Thames Water, is that housing is being pushed to obviously be built. The infrastructure cannot support the current demands from housing, and yet housing quotas keep landing on our doorsteps and they have to be built. And it appears that Thames Water cannot say no to supplying water to housing companies. I don't actually know the law here, but there has to be something that a water company can do to say, we cannot supply these houses reliably because it will put everybody else in jeopardy, and have some kind of backstop to prevent them just building houses and saying, yes, we'll provide water. They turn up the pressure to try and deliver it and the pipes burst and everything else. So it's a vicious circle, but I don't think that that is helping the situation either. I think we need to fix the infrastructure and then build property and environments around it. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Scully. Councillor Law.
Thank you. I'd like to add to something that both Councillor Goodrich and Mr. Scully just mentioned. Regarding Councillor Goodrich, yeah, some of us did end up dipping into our own pockets to find water from wherever we could source it, especially if we knew in advance that getting to Crown Court Car Park was pointless. I personally went to Tesco in Guildford and got as much water into my car that way, and was happy to hand that out to anybody who needed it. Regarding security of water, I forget which morning it was, but it was a morning where the Milford depot was going to open up. I arrived well before 8 o'clock. There was one person in one car who I believe was security. Great. And I thought he was going to be there until Thames Water turned up, but he actually left at about 8:30 before anybody else arrived. So I was free to fill up my car, trying to do the right thing. And that's why I ended up having a store of water. It's because I thought I would need it to hand out to people. Now I'm lumbered with it. So there is a point there about gap between security who are not Thames Water and Thames Water themselves. I don't know what the answer to that is. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hello, my name is Angela Shaw. I'm an environmental artist and part of the Dirty Water campaign. My particular concern is the chalk streams and the rivers. And we've heard from James Muller earlier that the CEO of Thames Water gave a very opaque answer to his question of the cause of this outage, rather like their water. And I would like a clear question asked to Thames Water. Did effluent, untreated sewage get into the reservoir? Was that the reason it had to be emptied and why the water supply was stopped? I heard previously that it fell empty. I believe, I have heard, it may not be true, but that it was emptied because it was contaminated. I don't know if people realize how interlinked the water supply is and the rivers. They pump in sewage, they take out water a bit lower down, clean it and give it back to you. And maybe they just put too much sewage into the water supply. Maybe that's why it was not fit for human consumption. So I would like Thames Water asked that direct question. Tell the truth. Was the water in the reservoir contaminated? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We also have one more question. Yes, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Hi, yes, I'm Cathy Gould. I'm representing the Cranley Society here today. We were at a meeting at the Cranley Village Hall regarding an outage in Cranley. And I just wanted to say that Thames Water promised us a meeting at the sewage plant in Cranley so that we could have a look round and have a look at the process. He took all our emails and that never happened. My understanding is that the last time the Cranley Sewage Works was upgraded was in 2016. And when you take into account the number of houses, the additional houses that we've had built, I'd like to ask Thames Water, is it not time that they upgraded that system so that they can actually cope with the infrastructure?
Thank you very much. Unless there are any other speakers, we have two questions which are going to be read from the Councillor Gale.
Sorry, Madam Mayor, just an observation. I think it was Councillor Martin who said that Thames Water had not come here tonight to answer questions because they were still going through the details of what had happened. And so they wouldn't actually be able to give us any responsible answers at that time. However, they could have been in this room and they could have taken away with them the questions that have been asked tonight. That would have been a far better option than having to get all these questions third hand. And I think they were very poor in not doing that. They could have explained their position, but they haven't bothered to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we come to two questions that have been presented.
So we're just going to try to get through to a couple of the questioners with whom we've had a bit of trouble one last time. And if we can't, they've written their questions, so we're happy to read them out. So Mr. Howard Brown, we'll try one last time to get through to you. If you...
Good evening, Chamber. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we've got you now. Thank you, Mr. Brown. You've
good,
got 3
excellent.
minutes.
Thank you very much. My name is Howard Brown. I represent the Hazelmere South Residents Association. We are very concerned with the delivery of potable water in Hazelmere. Councillor Wabini has already stated this, and we like to emphasise the point that we have got a lot of prospective new house builds. And Thames Water stated in August 2022 that they only had capacity for 49 new houses. Yet we have another nearly 200 houses. So the capacity is going to be exceeded. They stated the reservoirs on the Blackdown were not capable of delivering any more water. We have had the same outages as Guildford and Godalming last summer. And we see Bowsers going up, filling the reservoir, taking the water from, I believe it's Godalming, up to the top of the hill and refilling our reservoir. Very strange situation. The biggest situation we've seen is a new housing estate. Thames Water turned up within 2 hours to actually connect a new system because the client is paying. So Thames Water have got capacity, they have got the facilities, they're just not addressing all of the leaks that we're seeing around the town and the flooding which goes with it. So I'd like to know, shame Thames Water aren't here, is how they can meet this demand and all the new houses which are going forward or appear to be going forward when there is no capacity within the infrastructure to support it. I know there was a meeting with Thames Water, which Jeremy Hunt attended, saying there was a 5 to 7 year plan to bring Hazelmere into the ring main on water, which had a something like £20 million mark. With a 5 to 7 year plan, how can they put housing forward and build on new land when there's no water, even in the town as we speak? So I'd like to ask Mr. Thames Water, when he turns up, how is he going to meet this capacity? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. One more question.
So we'll now go to a Councillor Danielle Newsom. And
hello,
yeah.
everybody. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, well, thank you, Waverley, for hosting. I'm just dialed in because I'm the Tillingbourne councillor. I live opposite the Netley treatment works. We lose water quite a lot. We're an island supply. And recently, it's bad timing for them, really, I suppose. On the 25th of November, they did a drop-in session at Chilworth Village Hall about the pipeline they're building between Pewley and Netley Treatment Centre. And that was the 25th of November after your outage in Godalming and parts of Guildford. I am also a clinical negligence lawyer, and I was completely horrified that Farnham Road Hospital and the Royal Surrey had problems with water supply. This is ridiculous in 2023. I went there, I was quite annoyed with the man who was there from Thames Water, and I asked him what the reason for the outage was. And he said that the River Tillingbourne had flooded, and that has what had caused the treatment centre to stop working. And I said that was ridiculous because the Tillingbourne, you could literally walk through it in a pair of wellies, as most of you probably know. So I don't know how straight of an answer we're going to get from Thames Water. I'm fairly sceptical about what they're going to say. I think that they need better infrastructure, and I'm campaigning at this end as well. They're putting a £46 million pipe in from Pewley to Sheer. It's one way, so we can't even pump water back to Guildford if there's another problem. They said they're spending 12 million on Shalford. I asked him to email me details of what they were actually doing to Shalford, and he said he would, and he didn't. So I think there's lots of questions to ask Thames Water generally, is what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So unless there are any other statements or questions, Councillor Crowe.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just want to say that having listened to all of this, I just want to make one comment, and I think the whole situation illustrates why key infrastructure should be in the long term, well, short term, hopefully, but it will be long term, publicly owned and answerable to voters. It's about time.
Thank you. So I'm passing back to the panel.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to try and go through each of the basically each question that was issued by somebody who spoke. I'll then open it up to the panel, and there's a few officers of Waverley Borough Council in the room that I'm hoping might also be able to add some additional comments. So I'll start with James Muller. In terms of what happened, we also have been told a number of times that there were issues with power supply that were also part of the actual problem. We've also seen this happen in the past, and I'm sure Councillor Townsend will confirm that has been some of the causes of outages in in Cranley particularly, where a power outage has led to a water processing issue in their plants. So I entirely think it might be to do with that too, and it's going to be in our question to them about what actually happened and why, and I will specifically ensure that there is a subsidiary element of that that says, were there any issues with power that were part of that? The cloudy water aspects, which if I've got the terminology correct, is turbidity, which is sometimes put in some of the commentary, that was experienced in large parts of the borough. We're going to ask specifically what the causes of that was, because obviously quite a lot of residents had concerns that meant there were things in the water that might contaminate the supply. We were given reassurance on multiple occasions during the actual crisis itself that there were not issues with sewage in the water, but I've been asked that question by enough residents that we will put it in our formal questions to Thames Water and ask them about the water quality. I will just highlight the existence of groups such as Water Rangers, and we've got a few people who are either members of that organisation directly or have helped do testing for them. In terms of localised independent testing, they do a lot of good work and provide a lot of data in public about the quality of the different waterways in Waverley, and I will ensure that the comms from this session include links to their websites and how residents can take part in making that data better by going out and testing sections of local waterways. In terms of asking Thames Water to apologise, I think they should as well. I'm hoping they do when they're in person at the meeting next week. Certainly I will be asking them to do so. Any other comments from other members of the panel before I move on to the next? Councillor Townsend and Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. I just wanted to pick up a couple of points. As Councillor Follows has already mentioned, we've had the same issues. It's been when there's been an interruption in supply, it's been about power supply, it's been about turbidity, it's been about faulty valves, and that has been consistent issues. But they have always, it has been difficult to get the information out of Thames Water, and I'm not really confident that you will find out the true reason at all. However, coming back also to investment, and I know there was a question from Ed McCudden about the investment plans. Yes, Thames Water obviously published their 5-year business plans. They have a drainage and wastewater plan. However, how does that translate to actually what they are doing on the ground, and within the timeline? I mean, we have had some investment, as was mentioned about Councillor Tillybourne, about a tandem water main, which has been put in from linking up now Cranley, which was also an island before, so we couldn't get our water supply from anywhere else. So if Netley Mill was dry, there was no water, it had to be tankered into the area. So now we are currently being connected up by a pipe to the Shalford area, but now in recent weeks we are learning that Shalford is an island. So your island, which has already got problems, we are now part of your island. So, but we can't send water back to you. You can only send water to us. So it is a huge issue, and we need to see some real huge investment plans that Thames Water are going to undertake. And they need to resolve their leakage. They've got huge leakage. They need to make sure that we need to be looking at reservoirs. We need to be looking at long-term solutions. And unfortunately, Thames Water have not got that investment. They haven't got that investment plan in place, and they are sucking too much money out of the business currently. And we need to know clearly what plans they've got for the future for Waverley. And as part of our new local plan, that is something that we are going to carry out a full water cycle study, which will involve, from wastewater to water supply, will involve looking at all of that critical infrastructure. And I'm hoping that we will be able to get from Thames Water some clear and accountable investment plans from them, because it's very, it's easy for them just to say, we'll invest so many millions, but we need to know dates, and we need to know if they don't hit those dates, what will happen. And because, as it has been mentioned, and Councillor Scully mentioned it, we have got increasing government housing targets that we need to meet. We've gone from 590 now to 720 and houses per annum that we need to meet. But we need, and residents want, an infrastructure first approach, whether that's water supply, sewage supply, road network. We really need to see that infrastructure first before we can commit to building more and more houses which are just being plugged into what is a crumbling network, and the existing residents now suffering, whether or not, again, I think it was mentioned at the back something about water pressure in Cranley. Many people in Cranley still haven't had their water pressure returned since your issues. So I think someone's stealing our water to supplement your supply perhaps, but we haven't had, our water pressure hasn't returned either. So, these are big issues, and we need to know that there is a firm plan in place, that there is some accountability as well for that plan. Thank you.
Steve.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, big issues, and actually some very big questions that I think have been raised tonight. And I think it is incumbent on Thames Water to answer those questions. And we have recorded every single direct question that was asked tonight, and we will be expecting a direct response to those questions. And there's just one point that I want to make, because my memory stretches back quite a number of years, actually. And I can remember in 1989, we were told that the water industry needed investment because the infrastructure was a bit shaky. And the way of getting that infrastructure in place was to privatize the water supply industry, because otherwise, in about 30 years' time, we will have serious problems with that infrastructure. Here we are, 30 plus years on, and we have serious problems with that infrastructure and a serious awareness that privatization simply did not work. And we will not be able to get this infrastructure right until the water industry is taken into public ownership. But in the meantime, we have actually got to do everything we possibly can to try to hold Thames Water to account in the way that they have not responded to the crisis, and they've responded extraordinarily badly to the invitation to come to this meeting this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to try and go through each of the people that have asked questions so that you've at least had a response from us on these things, and an acknowledgement that we're going to incorporate them in the comments. So Councillor Hegan, you mentioned collection by car. Certainly that was something that I experienced quite heavily. I myself don't drive, so that was an intense treat, walking around with lots of water. In terms of compensation, I've seen at least two versions of the compensation issue. Some people who haven't had compensation at all, some who haven't had compensation that equals the amount of days that they were out with water. And that latter issue seems to be broken down again with people who Thames Water said they technically had water on a particular day, but actually what that actually meant in the real world was, a little trickle. It wasn't actually a usable supply on that day. So whether people are getting the correct compensation to actually compensate them for not having a usable supply on that day, I would put as a distinct difference from whether they technically had access to a little bit of water coming out of a tap somewhere. So we'll try and make that distinction clear. The question about water being delivered before the water outage happened is something that I'm keen to investigate elsewhere. That is curious. So we'll certainly be asking about that. Councillor Thompson, in terms of the questions about the structure of how Thames Water actually works, it is an incredibly complex structure. And I know you come from a position of being a professional person in the finance world. So the fact that even somebody like yourself is, having to engage in it in that way is very telling. Certainly, we have a number of other people with professional expertise on the council who've also looked at this and come up with similar concerns about how the structure works. from my perspective, it looks like it's deliberately opaque in order to disguise what goes out as dividends and what's logged as profit. And that unfortunately goes back to the root of it being a private company rather than some form of nationalised industry. Certainly, there'll be a few people looking into that in some more depth. Richard Ashworth, my apologies, I've gone back 2 years and made you a councillor again. Portsmouth Road low pressure, I know you are not the only person who has experienced that for sure. I can't comment right now on the funding of Mr. Hunt, and I'm not going to do that. What I will do is comment on votes in the House of Commons. Certainly I pay attention to how our MPs vote in the House of Commons, and there are clearly a number of areas where either Jeremy and Angela have not been present or not voted to restrict, restrain or regulate Thames Water in any meaningful way. These are things that can be looked up on the various public registers of how MPs act and vote. I believe there was also an amendment to a bill in the Commons earlier this week regarding compensation for those who were impacted or made sick by sewage, and Jeremy did not vote to support that amendment just this week. Paul from Pepper Harrow Parish Council, certainly in terms of water testing, there is at least one individual here who represents the water testing Water Rangers people over in the corner of a round circle, my apologies, and a number of us here who have involvement with that. One of the reasons that a lot of us do that is because we want to go and see if there's E. coli in the water and if there are other contaminants. And certainly the water testers who were looking at sections of the River Ock, for example, although there weren't contaminants from the water source, there were other contaminants in the water that we then wanted to flag with Thames Water. So certainly I would suggest if you've got members of your parish or other local residents who are interested in helping add to that data, be a very good contact for you. The Water Rangers would be a great source for you to have a word with. Talking about now to Christina in Wonersh in GU4 regarding the compensation issues, I was quite surprised when I saw Thames Water's own notices to see GU4 excluded from the list of postcodes, sorry, Blackheath, my apologies, Councillor Goodrich, to see GU4 in its entirety pretty much excluded from the areas that were said to be out. I had several notes from residents who had been impacted, and there is a wider issue, I think, about the fact that Thames Water don't recognise that there was an outage in some parts of those areas where there clearly was. We will make sure in our requests regarding details on compensation that we pick up the issues in GU4 specifically. I'm going to deal with infrastructure concerns and planning and housing as one matter at the end, and I'll prime our head of planning, who happens to be in the room, Claire Upson-Brown, if she wouldn't mind coming in on that in a little bit when I get to it. Councillor Law, you raised a number of issues, as did Councillor Gale and Councillor Ward, certainly about water stations. One of the things that we correctly, those of us in Milford, Godalming, Whitley, all highlighted right at the beginning was that if you only had one station in Godalming and another one on the edge of Guildford, you will either A, have a massive traffic jam, which prevents anybody getting to it and water being resupplied, which by the way is exactly what happened, of course, or you will cause half of Waverley that is impacted not to be able to access any water because it's too far away. Both those things occurred. Waverley requested, I think within the original, I think it was possibly within the first 12 hours, a station be set up where it often is in Milford. I communicated with you as chairman of the parish whether that was acceptable. You agreed. We all thought it was a great idea. We told Thames Water about it. They didn't do anything for about a day and a half, and eventually they did put a station up. I would also add that a call to residents and other concerned residents around Godalming came up with at least half a dozen other sites that Thames Water could have used, from the Oxford Ridge Social Club to various schools and other car parks and various other places, all of which Thames Water would not touch and would not do anything about. So when I was having to ask the police to allow water tankers to go down the other side of the road because they couldn't access the site because of traffic, that was one of the issues that we clearly had. And I'll get to the specific issue in Cranley regarding security, because there were some other related issues that we had elsewhere. Councillor Rabini and Hazelmere raised the issue of sewage and rainwater. There are lots of issues clearly where excess rain is causing issues with the infrastructure at water suppliers, as far as we can see. I would like to ask that question though about that specifically, because we get a lot of rumour that these things are an issue. I'd like a technical explanation from Thames Water if that's the case. Just moving to Councillor Austin in Bramley, certainly the issues that Bramley had, I mean, they were some of the longest out. There were a few houses in Bramley, I think, that were also out before the core outages that impacted most of the area. And I think for anybody who was beyond 6 or 7 days, they were almost all in Bramley. The questions I had from Bramley residents myself were really at that period of most frustration where Thames Water had declared the crisis over and everything was fine and everybody had their water back. And as Councillor Hunt in Guildford mentioned, we were both given that rather arbitrary number of 11. I put up a social media post the moment that I heard that and said, we've been told there's only 11 properties. Within, I think, 10 minutes, that was well and truly busted. And there were more than 10 residents in Bramley alone who had outages way longer than that and were obviously incredibly frustrated. So there was a lot of that elsewhere as well, but mostly that issue was in Bramley. There was also a few areas in the upper part of the Charterhouse ward in Godalming that had a similar issue because they were connected to a water tower which experienced the same problems. I'll do the one little political bit I'm going to do during these responses regarding the meeting next week. 5:15 in the afternoon is a little challenging for basically anybody with a job. So my concern is there, particularly as questions are submitted in advance, that some of the questions may not be as open and honest as the ones we've had here. So I myself am going to that meeting. I registered as a resident because that is the advice I had from Jeremy's office, that I was welcome to register as a resident. Subsequent conversations between Jeremy's office and Tom Horwood have confirmed that the borough leaders will be asked to speak. We received that yesterday, December the 7th, after having asked several times, both me and other people. So that is why we introduced that in the way that we did. I have certainly asked a question about how he intends to vote the next time a matter regarding Thames Water actually occurs in the House of Commons, because of course the place to actually scrutinise and hold Thames Water to account is, if you are a member of Parliament, the House of Commons. Moving then on to Councillor Deuce, I'm very happy to confirm that we'll look at local emergency resilience. We have an excellent local resilience officer that covers Guildford and Waverley, and we'll put that to her as soon as we pass our motion on the subject on Tuesday. In terms of stockpiles put at village halls, that's something, Councillor Goodridge, I think is an excellent idea. It would have saved a lot of issues in a few places, but I think we would need to look at the security issues that Cranley raised and how we deal with that. One question that Councillor Law mentioned regarding what to do with, in some cases, the huge storage of plastic bottles that we've got. Councillor Townsend, I think you've had prior experience of what happens with the bottle drops, if you want to just turn your mic on.
Well, I mean, to be honest, most people do recycle individually. I mean, Waverley did do some excellent work on gathering up a lot of the bottles. These are full bottles. And recycling, sorry, the full bottles, yeah. Thames Water won't take them back. I mean, once they're off the pallet, they're considered not to be, able to redistribute them. So to be honest, you might as well use them, or perhaps put them to the food bank or something.
Yeah. Exactly. I think that's probably the only thing we can do with them. There have been some people who've been asking me about whether we should store them in large quantities. There are issues about us storing large quantities of any fluids and substances, basically. So my advice would be either keep it, use it yourself, brace for the next disaster that's almost imminently coming anyway with a lot of these things, or donate to local food banks. Just in terms of some of the issues with security, certainly it's obviously appalling that anybody would do that during a crisis, though not completely unexpected. We also had some security concerns in a few of the other areas where the where the workers from Thames Water who were divvying out the water, and those guys did fantastic work. They were out there a long time in pretty unpleasant weather. They were also getting some harassment from residents and some others that were trying to cause them a problem. So I would also just flag the security of those people who are out there doing that work. I had a lot of issues with Thames Water, but none of them were with the people who were dealing out the water on the ground. They were just doing what they were told. They relayed, I know, on several occasions, requests for additional water stations because it was causing them as many problems as it was us. Finally, I think I will just ask Claire if you're happy to comment on how Thames Water interact in the planning process, because there are some issues with that I think we should probably highlight.
Yeah, so in terms of the interaction with Thames Water, and I sort of speak with having worked in other areas and having different relationships with Southern Water and Wessex Water. In terms of Thames Water, they engage, as Liz has described, in the plan making process in what's called the infrastructure delivery plan. So looking at the scale of development that's likely come forward and what the supply of, in this case, water would be. However, the way their business planning works, they won't put a scheme forward into their system for investment until there's planning permission in place, etc., which sometimes doesn't align with the way development is delivered. And so you get that mismatch around infrastructure delivery and the right for developers to connect. I think the other issue that is probably worth just touching on is around surface water drainage and how that is or isn't dealt with, and sometimes the lack of objection from Thames Water that I've seen now in a number of applications that I've looked into, where Thames Water aren't objecting to surface water entering the sewage water system, which cause then localised flooding in periods of high waterfall. So that's another area. So I think there are a number of issues. I guess if I was being asked by Paul, what would I be asking Thames Water for? So not prompting you, Paul, but what I'd be asking them for is to actually begin to have a collaborative way of working so that we can understand how development, when development's being delivered and where it's being delivered. And we can work together to ensure that they are doing the necessary upgrades to the system, and also ensuring that surface water isn't being passed into sewage systems.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to take one final comment from Councillor Hunt, one final comment from Councillor Townsend, and then I'll go to the Mayor to sum up.
Thank you. We've rightly focused on the impact of the outage on residents, and I just wanted to reflect on the impact on hospitals. We've talked a little bit about the Farnham Road Hospital in Guildford. Councillor Newson from Tinningbourne mentioned the Royal Surrey. I also want to mention the impact on schools. A number of schools had to close as a result of the outage, as a result of not having water. That impacted not just the children's education, but also the parents who had to take time off work in order to look after their children. And finally, I just wanted to reflect on the businesses that were impacted. You know, the number of restaurants that had to close because they didn't have water will have severely impacted a number of business, the livelihood of a number of businesses. And I think Thames Water should reflect on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up one thing as well, in that, you know, politics aside, we do need to put pressure on our MPs, because at the moment, you know, when we were part of the European Water Framework Directive, water was tested every annually. Now it's every 3 years. Toxic chemicals and pesticides, which are banned in the EU, are still being used in the UK. Ministers have tried to rip up pollution rules. They've delayed environmental laws coming into the planning system. We haven't got the Environmental Act coming through, the Environment Act yet coming through into the planning policy. Luckily, the House of Lords defeated the government against amendments to the Levelling Up Bill, which would have forced local authorities like us to turn a blind eye to pollution from new development. And luckily as well, so the nutrient neutrality that they tried to get rid of, again, hasn't been passed through. But there seems to be a push. There does seem to be a push from this government to allow pollution, more pollution to enter into our rivers and our seas. And the public clearly want to clean up our rivers and our seas. And you know, we've seen a delay to the biodiversity net gain coming through to planning. You know, it was promised, it hasn't come through. I've just had a quick look at this storm sewage map. So, you know, the Thames Water do have a storm map where overflows for storms are literally, there are pipes in rivers straight from the sewage system that just put sewage, raw sewage out into rivers, and these can be very small streams. They might be designated as major rivers, but they can be very small streams. There's been no storm. Look at this map This is the storm overflow in the Thames water. All those reds are discharging raw sewage. All those ambers are discharging raw sewage. You know, we are seeing this now time and time again. You've got organisations like Surfers Against Sewage. You know, this isn't political. This is people wanting their environment to be cleaned up, wanting to see that these water companies are not allowed to discharge indiscriminately raw sewage into our rivers and seas, you know, ruining our environment. And also there is no accountability for it. You know, it's all very well, Claire, and you know, Claire, obviously I've got the portfolio for planning and I'm extremely keen on working with Thames Water, but we don't have that accountability. We can't say to them, you know, we can't put in place any kind of penalties if Thames Water do not meet what they promise, what they've said they are going to meet. So we do need that. We need to be supported by our government so that, you know, we clean up the water system and that we have clean rivers and seas and that we clean up our environment for us and for the next generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And just before I hand back to the Mayor, I'd just like to say thank you everybody for joining tonight, whether it be here in the room on the Zoom or to the number of people that have also submitted written statements. I'm now going to hand back to the Mayor, but once again, thank you all for participating in this event. And I do hope many of you will also attend the event at the University of Surrey next week and raise some of these issues there. Certainly I will be there raising some of the issues that you've put forward to this meeting. And I'll now hand back to the Mayor of Waverley, Councillor Penny Rivers.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to sum up, and this is my summary. The panel will meet again in the next few days to confirm that all issues have been accounted for and that any issues raised through this written testimony have been considered. The key themes arising will form part of an amendment to a tabled motion to Waverley's full council meeting this coming Tuesday, the 12th of December. These to include writing to Thames Water for a full response to the points raised, an apology to affected residents, and a full explanation of what happened. Communications with residents from Thames Water needing to be more regular and transparent. Concerns about compensation payments. Concerns about the financial situation of Thames Water. Ongoing issues around sewerage across Waverley. Consideration for vulnerable residents in receiving water and those made vulnerable by the situation, e.g. those who do not drive. The cleanup of the plastic waste. The need for an approved list of water stations to help local authorities. What is Thames Water's long-term plan for how to resolve these issues? Discussion around looking at our own local resilience plan for such emergencies. Requesting that Thames Water categorically answer as to whether contamination of the water supply occurred. Concerns around inadequate water infrastructure amid new housing being built. That water had been delivered well in advance of the outage to some vulnerable residents, and ongoing water pressure issues. So I too thank you all for coming to this evening's meeting. It is really very good to talk about this vital issue. As you know, my name is Penny Rivers, and there's another Rivers at the back. We're very interested in keeping rivers healthy. I know, I couldn't help it, sorry. But by listening to everybody tonight means that we can better represent our community and the residents' needs. So thank you all for coming, and I wish you a safe journey home.